Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. The night sky outside shimmered with stars, their light dimmed by the glow of the ballroom inside. The scent of roses and lavender wafted through the air, blending with the faint hum of a live orchestra. Guests mingled, their laughter rising in bubbles of excitement as glasses of champagne were raised and toasts were made in honor of the bride and groom. It was, by all means, a night to be remembered. In the midst of all this luxury and elegance stood Emma, a woman whose presence seemed almost unnoticed, overshadowed by the wealth that adorned every corner of the room. She didn't belong here, not in the eyes of the people around her. She wasn't invited by the bride or groom, but she had found her way into this high society event somehow. Despite her apparent lack of wealth, there was an air of confidence around her. Her quiet poise wasn't lost on a few of the more astute guests, but they, too, felt a sense of discomfort in her presence. Her dress, a simple dark green silk number, contrasted sharply with the sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos that surrounded her. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant, but understated bun, and her makeup was minimal, showcasing natural beauty rather than the extravagant enhancements most women here sported. She felt out of place, but there was a calmness in her that others found almost unsettling. She stood at the corner of the room, near the massive windows that overlooked the garden. The guests, all dressed in their finest clothes, moved in and out, laughing and exchanging pleasantries, but none seemed to spare her a second glance. She wasn't the kind of person they expected to see here, let alone in their inner circle. As she watched, a group of women in sparkling evening gowns drifted by her. They didn't even notice Emma standing in the corner, too absorbed in their conversation to care about the unknown woman standing alone. One of the women, her voice too loud for comfort, turned and whispered to her friends. "Can you believe she's here?" The woman's laughter was laced with disdain. "I heard she's some kind of assistant to one of the catering staff. I can't imagine how she managed to get in here." The group of women snickered, their eyes briefly flicking over Emma before they turned back to each other. It wasn't a subtle mockery, and Emma could feel the heat rise in her cheeks. But there was no sign of surprise in her eyes, just an overwhelming sense of determination. She had been here before. Not physically, but in every other way. The judgment, the whispers, the looks of disdain from those who thought themselves superior. Emma had always known she was different. But she had never cared about fitting in. That wasn't her goal anymore. Her mission tonight was clear. To remind these people just how wrong they were. Her fingers brushed against the glass of the champagne flute she had been holding. She had barely touched it, but she had to keep up appearances. If they were going to treat her like an outsider, she'd play along. Just long enough to make them understand. Emma's phone buzzed again, its screen lighting up with another simple message: "It's time." The weight of those 3 words caused her breath to catch. It wasn't a message she had expected to receive, but it was one that made her heart race with anticipation. The time had finally come, the moment when her secret would be revealed, and everything would change. She had worked too hard for this. She had waited too long to let anyone, especially these people, define her worth. She wasn't just a guest at this wedding. She was here for a reason. A reason that would soon unfold before their very eyes. And when it did, they would never forget her. Her eyes flicked across the room, scanning the sea of faces. The bride, a vision in her sparkling white gown, was surrounded by guests congratulating her, making her feel like the center of attention. The groom stood beside her, smiling with the air of a man who had it all: wealth, status, power. Emma's eyes narrowed. To them, everything was a game. The dresses, the jewelry, the laughter, all just pieces of a carefully curated image. But the truth was that they weren't as untouchable as they believed. As the couple exchanged a few words with their guests, Emma felt a strange calmness wash over her. This was it. She had waited long enough. It was time to make her move. She wasn't sure who would be the first to notice, but as she walked toward the center of the room, she could feel all eyes slowly starting to turn in her direction. It was as if the music had suddenly quieted, the chatter fading into a hum of curiosity. She wasn't a nobody, not anymore. She was someone who had the power to leave them speechless. The crowd parted slightly as she made her way across the floor, her steps deliberate, confident. She wasn't sure if she was walking into a lion's den or if she was about to break free from the shadows. But she knew that every step was a step toward changing everything. This was her moment. The bride and groom, unaware of Emma's impending reveal, continued their conversations, oblivious to the woman making her way toward them. But the whispers began. The low murmur of voices started to creep into the air, like a ripple that spread through the crowd. Is she? No way, it can't be. She must be someone's relative. Who let her in? Emma smiled to herself, the anticipation bubbling inside her like an unstoppable force. She reached the front of the room and paused for a moment, looking at the bride and groom. It was a simple gesture, but one that stopped everyone in their tracks. The groom, dressed in his tailored suit and confident smile, glanced at her with the sort of haughty indifference most millionaires showed to people like her. But Emma didn't flinch. Instead, she waited for the right moment, letting the silence grow thicker around her. Then, finally, with a calm yet unmistakable tone, she spoke, "I'm sorry to interrupt your special day, but there's something you all need to know." The room fell silent. Even the bride's smile faltered for a split second, and the chatter died down. Everyone turned their attention to Emma, their eyes filled with disbelief. With a brief look at the couple, Emma reached into her purse, pulling out a sleek black envelope. She held it up, her hands steady, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. "What is this?" the bride asked, her voice laced with annoyance but tinged with curiosity. Emma smiled. "This," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, "is the beginning of the end of everything you think you know." The crowd gasped. The bride and groom exchanged nervous glances. "I'm not who you think I am," Emma continued. "And tonight, you're going to find out just how wrong you've all been." The room was frozen, as if time itself had stopped. Emma stood there, holding the black envelope in her hand, her gaze unwavering. The eyes of the entire room were locked on her, some filled with disbelief, others with confusion. The atmosphere, once filled with laughter and excitement, was now thick with tension. It was a feeling Emma had become all too familiar with, being the center of attention for reasons no one understood, for reasons they would soon regret. "Could you please clarify what you mean?" The bride's voice was sharp now, though there was an undercurrent of nervousness beneath her words. She had no idea who Emma was, but the tone of the woman in front of her suggested something was very wrong. Emma's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "This envelope," she said, raising it slightly higher, "contains the truth about the woman you're marrying and the man standing beside you." The bride blinked, clearly thrown off by the accusation. Her face paled slightly. She began, but the words faltered on her lips. The groom, noticing the unease in his bride's eyes, stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from celebratory to defensive. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with authority. "This is a private event, and you have no right to be here, let alone make such accusations." Emma remained calm. She had been expecting this reaction, and she knew how to handle it. Her gaze swept over the crowd, which had now gathered around her, the whispers becoming louder by the second. It was only a matter of time before someone in the crowd would make a move, but Emma wasn't intimidated. She had waited too long for this moment. "You're right," Emma said, addressing the groom's anger. "This is a private event. But what I'm about to reveal isn't just about this wedding. It's about your lives, your lies, and the secrets you've been keeping hidden. And no one," she paused, her voice growing stronger, "no one should live in the dark any longer." There was a gasp from the crowd. The groom's face contorted in confusion, his initial anger turning to suspicion. He looked at his bride, who was now visibly pale, her hands trembling. Emma could see the flicker of panic in her eyes. The bride was terrified. And that fear, that vulnerability, would soon become a key part of Emma's revelation. "Are you insane?" the groom spat, his eyes narrowing. "You've lost your mind. Who the hell are you to come in here and threaten us?" Emma ignored him. She had bigger things to focus on. The crowd was watching now, every single person in the room waiting for her next move. It was as if the entire world had paused for her words. And with that kind of attention, she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move could ruin everything. She stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor, her eyes locked on the bride. "I know you," Emma said softly, her tone not quite as harsh as before, but still full of certainty. "I know who you really are. And so do you." The bride's face twisted with confusion, but Emma saw something deeper there, a flicker of recognition, followed by a flash of fear. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some random accusation. Emma had dug deep, uncovered secrets that had been buried for years. And now, it was time to reveal them. The groom, still on edge, reached for the envelope in Emma's hand, but Emma pulled it back slightly, not allowing him to touch it. "You don't get to open it," she said firmly. "Not yet. Not until I say so." "What is this?" The groom's voice was shaking now, less certain, but still full of arrogance. "What are you trying to pull? Do you really want to know?" Emma asked, her voice cold as steel. "Because once you know, there's no going back." The room was completely silent now. The orchestra had stopped playing, and even the guests who had once been chattering in groups had fallen quiet. Every eye in the room was on Emma, waiting for her to continue. And with that, she began. "I know about the affair," Emma said, her voice quiet but deliberate. "The affair that started long before this wedding. The affair that has been going on for years, right under your noses. I know about the woman who was once part of your life, the woman you left behind without a second thought, all for the sake of money, status, and power." The bride's face went even paler, if possible. The guests looked at each other, murmurs starting to spread like wildfire. The groom's face twisted in anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "Don't say another word," the groom warned, stepping toward Emma. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know who I am." "Oh, I know exactly who you are," Emma replied, her voice rising now. "You're a man who will stop at nothing to protect his image. A man who thinks that wealth and power can cover up the truth. But it doesn't work that way." Emma turned toward the bride, her gaze softening for just a moment. "And you," she said, her tone more sympathetic now, "you thought you were marrying someone who would make all your dreams come true. But all you were really doing was becoming part of a lie." The bride opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, as if looking for someone to rescue her. But no one was coming. Not now. Emma held up the envelope again. "You wanted to be part of the elite. You wanted to walk in their shoes, wear their dresses, live in their mansions. But you didn't know that to get all that, you had to leave a piece of your soul behind." Tears welled up in the bride's eyes, and Emma saw the flicker of regret in her gaze. It wasn't a sign of guilt, but of realization. She had been sold a dream, and it had all come crashing down in the worst possible way. The groom, desperate now, reached for the envelope once more. "Enough of this," he shouted, but Emma moved out of his reach, her eyes never leaving the couple. "Do you want to know what's in this envelope?" Emma asked, her voice steady and calm. "Do you want to know how far back the lies go? Because you might not like the answer." The groom, still furious, took a step back. He was no longer sure of himself. The walls were closing in, and he could feel the weight of Emma's words settling in the pit of his stomach. His eyes flicked to the bride, who was shaking now, her hands pressed against her chest as if to hold herself together. "I'm not afraid of you," the groom spat, though the defiance in his voice lacked conviction. Emma could feel the energy in the room shift. The guests, now completely intrigued, were no longer just spectators. They were invested in this drama, waiting for the revelation to come. And Emma wasn't about to let them down. "It's not just about the affair," Emma continued, her voice low but intense. "It's about everything you've built on lies. The false charity work, the corruption, the way you've manipulated everyone around you. This wedding was just another performance for you, another way to cover up your darkest secrets. But it's all coming to light now." The groom's face twisted with fury. "You don't know anything about me," he yelled, his face flushed with anger. But there was something different in his eyes now, a flicker of doubt. Emma reached into the envelope, her hand trembling slightly as she pulled out a series of documents. She looked at them one last time before holding them up for the crowd to see. "This," she said, "is the proof. This is the evidence of everything you've been hiding. And the truth is finally going to come out." She let the room absorb her words before she dropped the bombshell. And just as the tension reached its peak, she opened the documents in front of the crowd. The gasps that followed were enough to shake the very foundation of the lavish wedding. The gasps from the crowd were deafening. Every eye in the room was on Emma, who stood at the center, holding the documents that had the power to destroy everything. The once joyful wedding atmosphere had turned into an oppressive silence, each guest holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Emma glanced around the room, watching the faces of the bride and groom, their expressions shifting from anger to fear. The groom's face was pale, his fists still clenched at his sides. The bride, though attempting to hold herself together, was visibly shaking, her lips quivering as she tried to find the words to respond. But nothing came. Emma allowed the silence to linger for a moment, savoring the feeling of power that coursed through her. This was her moment, the culmination of years of research, patience, and calculated planning. The truth was finally being exposed, and there was no turning back. The guests began to murmur among themselves, the whispers growing louder with each passing second. Some of them, the more curious ones, started to inch closer to Emma, eager to see the evidence she held. Others, the ones more invested in maintaining the facade of their perfect lives, backed away, uncertain of what to do. The bride finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "What is this? What are you trying to say?" Emma could see the desperation in her eyes, the fear that had replaced the confident smile from earlier in the evening. The bride, once so sure of herself and her position in the world, now seemed fragile, vulnerable. Her mask of perfection was crumbling, and Emma could feel a sense of satisfaction as she watched it fall apart. "You know exactly what I'm saying," Emma replied coldly, her voice carrying across the room. "This wedding, this entire event, it's nothing more than a performance. A performance to hide the truth." The bride flinched, but Emma didn't stop. The groom, his face red with anger, stepped forward, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to regret this," he said, his eyes burning with fury. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Who do you think you are, coming here and destroying our lives?" Emma didn't flinch. "I'm someone who refuses to let you keep lying to everyone. You think your money can buy you protection. You think you can bury the truth with your wealth. But you can't hide from what's real. Not anymore." The crowd had grown uneasy. The energy in the room was palpable, nervous glances were exchanged, and the once opulent atmosphere now felt suffocating. Guests who had once envied the bride and groom's success were beginning to question everything they thought they knew. Emma opened the envelope, taking a deep breath as she prepared to reveal the damning evidence. The documents inside were not just pieces of paper, they were the key to unraveling the empire the groom had built. Emma had spent years gathering information, connecting the dots, and exposing the lies that had kept him at the top. She looked down at the first document, a series of contracts detailing illegal land acquisitions, bribery, and exploitation of workers. The groom's name was on every page. But it wasn't just his name, there were others involved, people who had supported his rise to power. People who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of those beneath them in exchange for wealth and influence. This, Emma said, holding up the first contract, is just the beginning. The groom's face twisted with rage. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've done to get here. This is my life, my business. You have no right to destroy it. Emma looked at him, her eyes hardening. You had no right to destroy the lives of the people you stepped on to get here. The workers you exploited, the families you ruined, all for what? Power? Money? The groom took a step back, as if the weight of Emma's words was beginning to sink in. He had spent his entire life building an empire, carefully constructing a narrative of success and superiority. But all of it, every accomplishment, every dollar, was based on lies. Emma held up the next document, a series of emails between the groom and a high-ranking official, discussing ways to cover up a massive fraud involving charitable donations. The charity, which had been advertised as a cause for the greater good, was nothing more than a front for laundering money into the groom's personal accounts. This, Emma said, her voice cutting through the tension, is how you've been hiding the truth. Using the guise of philanthropy to cover up your corruption. Pretending to care about the world while lining your pockets. The room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The guests stood frozen, their eyes flicking between the documents in Emma's hands and the couple standing at the front of the room, their lives unraveling before them. Emma turned her attention to the bride. You're not the victim here. You've been complicit in this. You've known about all of this, haven't you? The fraud. The manipulation. The lies. The bride's face flushed with anger. I had no choice. I loved him, and I wanted to be part of his world. But I didn't know all of this was happening. I didn't know. Emma shook her head. You chose to ignore it. You chose to turn a blind eye because it benefited you. You were willing to marry a man who was built on lies because you wanted the luxury, the fame, the power. And now, it's all falling apart. The groom stepped forward again, his hands raised as if to physically silence Emma. Enough, he shouted. You don't get to talk to her like that. You don't know what she's been through. You have no idea what we've been through to get here. Emma's gaze remained unwavering. You're right, she said, her voice steady. I don't know what you've been through. But I do know what you've done to get here. And that's what matters. The guests were still watching, waiting for the next move. Some of them looked ashamed, as if they were realizing just how much they had overlooked in their admiration of the groom's success. Others, however, seemed more interested in protecting their own reputations than facing the truth. Emma took a deep breath and turned to face the crowd. I didn't come here to ruin your wedding. I came here to give you the truth. You can either ignore it and continue living in your lies, or you can face what's really going on. But one thing is clear, you can't hide anymore. She let the weight of her words sink in before speaking again. You all think you know who the groom is. You think he's a successful businessman, a philanthropist, a man of influence. But the truth is, he's a fraud. He's built his empire on the backs of those he's crushed along the way. The groom's eyes were wide now, a mixture of fear and fury flashing across his face. The bride was no longer crying. Instead, she stood stiffly, her eyes darting around the room, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Emma had exposed their lives for what they truly were, nothing more than an illusion. And the truth, Emma said, is something none of you can escape. The room remained silent. The guests were beginning to stir, some whispering to each other, others looking toward the exit as if considering leaving. But no one moved. They were all trapped in the web of lies that Emma had just uncovered, and there was no turning back. Emma let the silence hang in the air for a few moments longer, savoring the tension. Then, she turned to the couple once more, her voice soft but deadly serious. "You've been living a lie for far too long. And now, everyone knows." The silence in the room stretched on, suffocating and heavy, as Emma stood with the documents in her hand. The groom and bride, once confident and assured in their roles as the centerpieces of this extravagant affair, now looked like two people caught in a storm they could no longer control. The guests, who had all gathered to celebrate the union of the two wealthy individuals, now found themselves unwillingly thrust into a much darker reality, a reality in which the perfect facade of wealth, success, and privilege had come crumbling down. Emma took a step back, her eyes scanning the room. Her heart raced with adrenaline. She had anticipated this moment for years, and now that it was here, it was nothing like what she had imagined. There were no cheers of victory or expressions of relief. Instead, the room was filled with uneasy tension, with everyone waiting for someone to take control of the situation. The groom, his face a shade of red Emma had never seen before, gritted his teeth. He had clearly lost his composure. All the anger and arrogance that had defined him before had been replaced with panic. He looked like a cornered animal, and it was only a matter of time before he lashed out. "You think you've won, don't you?" The groom's voice was a low growl. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "This doesn't change anything. I'll make sure you regret this. You've made a mistake you can never take back." Emma didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, the documents still in her hand, waiting for him to settle down. His words were nothing but hollow threats, empty words that people like him often resorted to when they were exposed for what they truly were. And she wasn't scared of him. Not anymore. Behind him, the bride remained frozen in place, her face pale, her lips pressed together tightly as if she was trying to hold her composure. She had gone from a vision of happiness and joy to a woman shattered by the truth. She looked lost, her gaze flickering between Emma and the groom. There was a sense of realization in her eyes, but also an overwhelming sense of regret. "You don't know what you're doing," the bride finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea how much this will cost me." Emma could see the despair in her eyes. It was the kind of despair that came not from the fear of public humiliation, but from the internal realization that everything they had worked so hard to build was built on lies, lies that Emma had just exposed to the world. "You had a choice," Emma said calmly, her voice even, just like everyone else in this room. "You could have walked away from all of this. But instead, you chose to ignore it. You chose to bury your head in the sand and keep playing the game. Well, the game's over now." The bride's hands shook as she reached for her glass of champagne, but she didn't drink. Her fingers trembled, the glass barely making contact with her lips. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to hit her, and Emma could see the guilt start to creep into her eyes. She was complicit in everything that had been exposed. She hadn't been a mere bystander, she had chosen to participate in the deceit. The guests, meanwhile, were still murmuring among themselves. Some of them had started to back out of the room, avoiding the confrontation altogether. They weren't interested in being a part of the chaos that had just unfolded. But there were others, the ones who had seen through the glitz and glamour, who had suspected that something wasn't right but had been too afraid to speak out. Now, they were hanging on every word Emma said, waiting to see how far this revelation would go. Emma stepped forward, the weight of the documents in her hand serving as a reminder of the truth she was carrying with her. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Every word she spoke now would either make or break this moment. "Do you want to know what else is in these documents?" she asked, her eyes trained on the couple before her. "Because what I've shown you so far is just the tip of the iceberg. I have everything, every single piece of evidence of what you've done to get here. And I'm not stopping until everyone knows." The groom's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He was out of words, out of excuses. The man who had spent his life cultivating a perfect image of wealth, influence, and success was now standing in front of the very people he had deceived, with nothing left to hide behind. The bride, her eyes glistening with tears, turned away from Emma. She couldn't look at her anymore, unable to bear the weight of her own guilt. Emma saw her turn her head, but she didn't feel sympathy. The bride had chosen this path, knowing full well the consequences of aligning herself with someone like the groom. She had bought into the illusion, and now she was forced to face the reality. The guests were starting to murmur louder now, many of them looking uncomfortable, unsure of what to do. Some of them began whispering among themselves, pointing at the documents in Emma's hand and speculating about the things they had just learned. This wedding, which was supposed to be a celebration, had turned into a nightmare that none of them had expected. Emma could see a few people from the back of the room, guests who had been friends with the groom, starting to move toward the exit. They weren't willing to stay and witness the destruction of the empire they had once admired. But there were others, ones who had always known that something wasn't right, who were now eager to find out more. "You can leave if you want," Emma said, addressing the crowd, her voice cutting through the noise. "But this is the truth. The truth that you've been ignoring for so long. If you walk out of this room now, you're just as guilty as the rest of them." There was a moment of hesitation, and then, one by one, the guests started to slowly back away, retreating into the corners of the room, unsure of how to react. The once bustling atmosphere of the wedding had transformed into a cold, uncomfortable silence. Even the music, which had once played so cheerfully, had come to a complete stop. The groom stepped forward again, his chest heaving as he tried to compose himself. "This is all lies," he spat, though his voice was shaking now. "You have no proof. This means nothing." Emma took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You're right," she said calmly, "it's all lies. Lies that you've been telling everyone, your friends, your employees, your wife. And now, the truth is finally out. You can't run from it anymore." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Guests shuffled nervously, some glancing toward the door, others too captivated by the drama to look away. Emma could feel their eyes on her, their judgment heavy, their curiosity endless. They wanted to know more, to understand how far this web of lies extended, and most importantly, how they could avoid being caught up in it. Finally, the bride spoke again, her voice trembling. "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this?" Emma's gaze softened for a moment. But only for a moment. She had no sympathy left to give. The time for mercy had passed. "I don't want anything from you," Emma said, her voice steady. "I just want the truth to be known. And for you to face the consequences of your actions." And with that, Emma turned away from the couple, her heart still pounding in her chest, but a sense of calm settling over her. She had done what she came to do. The truth had been exposed. There was nothing more to say. The rest was up to them. The air was thick with tension. The once luxurious wedding reception had transformed into an arena of uncomfortable silence, as the guests, unsure of how to proceed, exchanged cautious glances. Emma stood at the center, the document still in her hand, watching as the groom and bride struggled to come to terms with the truth that had been laid bare before them. The groom, who had once stood as a beacon of success and power, now seemed like a broken man. His usual arrogance had been replaced with desperation. He had nowhere to hide now. The carefully constructed image of the perfect businessman, the successful entrepreneur, the philanthropist, everything he had built over the years, was collapsing before his eyes. The bride, once so poised and confident, was visibly crumbling. Her hands, which had once held a champagne glass with grace, now trembled uncontrollably. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't just the public exposure of the lies that hurt, it was the realization that the person she had married, the man she had trusted, had been living a double life. A life filled with deception, corruption, and manipulation. The silence in the room was deafening, but it wasn't the kind of silence that came after a heated argument. No, this silence was more like a holding pattern, a moment of suspended disbelief before the inevitable crash. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next words to be spoken, for the next step to be taken. And Emma? Emma had finally done it. She had exposed the truth. She had stripped away the layers of lies that had protected the groom and his world for so long. But now, she was forced to face the consequences of her actions, and there was no way to predict what would happen next. As she stood there, the weight of the moment began to settle in. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She had become a part of this story, a part of this unraveling. The chaos she had set in motion wasn't something she could control. The truth had been unleashed, and now it was up to the bride and groom, as well as the guests, to reckon with it. The first to break the silence was one of the guests, a middle-aged man who had been a silent observer throughout the ordeal. He cleared his throat nervously, stepping forward to address the groom. I don't know what to say, he began, his voice shaky. This is unbelievable. The groom, still seething with anger, turned to face him, his eyes burning with fury. Unbelievable? You think I care what you think? He spat, his words dripping with venom. This is my life, my business. You think you can come in here and destroy everything I've worked for? Do you have any idea what you're doing? Emma watched as the guests shifted uneasily. The man who had spoken, realizing the situation was escalating, took a step back. He wasn't the only one who had been swept into the whirlwind of scandal. Everyone in the room was feeling the aftershocks of Emma's revelations. Those who had once admired the groom, who had envied his success, were now questioning everything. And the bride? She was no longer the woman in the white dress, the glowing bride, she was a woman exposed, standing in the ruins of her own dreams. I've worked for this, the groom continued, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. I've sacrificed everything for this. Do you think I'm just going to let you tear it all down? Do you have any idea what it took to get here? Emma's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. I know exactly what it took, she said, her voice cold and steady. I know about the lies, the manipulation, the people you've hurt along the way. You didn't build this empire with hard work and honesty. You built it on the backs of people you crushed. And now it's all coming down. The groom's face twisted with a mixture of fury and fear. His anger had always been his defense, his shield against the world. But now, that shield was cracking, and there was nowhere for him to hide. You're a liar, the bride finally spoke, her voice breaking through the tension. You lied to me. You lied to everyone. I married you, I believed in you, and now she stopped, her voice faltering. The tears that had been building up finally spilled over, but this time, they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of regret, of betrayal. Emma turned her attention to the bride. You knew, she said softly, but there was no kindness in her tone. You knew the kind of man you were marrying. You may not have known all the details, but you knew enough. You chose to ignore the signs because it was easier to believe in the illusion. But now the truth is out. You can't run from it anymore. The bride's sobs grew louder, and she collapsed into the arms of one of the guests. Emma didn't look away. She couldn't afford to. This was the moment where everything would either collapse into chaos or be rebuilt from the wreckage. The room was still in shock, but the whispers had started. People were speaking in hushed tones, exchanging opinions, trying to make sense of what had just been revealed. The groom's once loyal supporters were starting to question his integrity, and the guests who had come to admire him for his wealth were now wondering how they had been so easily fooled. Emma turned toward the crowd, her voice rising above the murmur. This, she said, holding up the remaining documents, is just the beginning. You all need to understand something. The man you all admired? He's not who you think he is. And neither is the woman beside him. They've built their lives on lies, on manipulation, on taking advantage of others. And now, the truth is out. She looked at the groom and bride one last time before speaking again. You've spent your whole lives lying, pretending to be something you're not. But no more. The world will know what you've done. The world will know who you really are. The groom took a step toward her, his fists clenched. But this time, there was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, overwhelming fear. Fear that everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You think this is over, the groom said, his voice barely a whisper. You think the truth will set you free? You're wrong. It's only just begun. Emma didn't flinch. She had heard threats like this before. She had faced people who believed that their wealth and power could shield them from the consequences of their actions. But she knew better. The truth had a way of tearing down even the tallest walls, even the most impregnable fortresses. No, she said, her voice low and unwavering. It's over for you. And for her. She gestured toward the bride. You've been living in a dream, but now you're awake. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as the guests began to shift uneasily. Some, who had once admired the groom for his business acumen, were now looking at him with disdain. Others, who had felt sorry for the bride, now saw her as a victim of her own choices. Emma took a step back, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. I didn't come here to destroy your lives. I came here to give you the truth. You can't hide from it anymore. You can't hide from who you are. The guests had no idea how to react. Some of them were still in shock, unable to process the truth they had just heard. Others were beginning to speak, their voices rising in disbelief, in outrage, in sympathy for the people they had once admired. As the room began to stir, Emma turned to leave. She had done what she came to do. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back. The couple's lives, once built on lies, were now in shambles. The guests, too, were left to reckon with their own complicity in allowing these lies to continue unchecked. As Emma reached the door, she paused for a moment. The crowd was still murmuring, and the bride and groom were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. For Emma, it was over. The battle had been won. But the war? That was still to come. The wedding hall that had once been the scene of extravagant celebration was now a place of whispered conversations, hushed voices, and strained silence. The clinking of champagne glasses had stopped, the soft hum of the orchestra replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Guests shuffled about the room, some still in disbelief, others nervously avoiding the couple they had once admired. Emma had left the room moments ago, but the tension remained thick in the air. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back now. The wedding was no longer a symbol of love and unity, it was a symbol of deception and betrayal. And the bride and groom were left to face the harsh reality of the world they had built for themselves. The groom, who had once been the epitome of confidence, was now a shattered figure. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, were now clouded with fear and regret. He paced back and forth, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. His suit, once pristine, now looked wrinkled and disheveled. His jaw clenched as he fought to suppress the panic rising in his chest. How did this happen? He muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. How did I let this happen? Behind him, the bride stood in a daze, her back against a wall, her hands pressed to her face as though trying to block out the reality of the situation. Her eyes were red from crying, her makeup smeared, and her once perfect gown now seemed out of place, as if mocking her with its beauty. She had spent so many years chasing a dream that had promised wealth, power, and status. But that dream was built on lies, and now it was crumbling around her. The groom turned toward her, his expression one of frustration and anger. This isn't over, he spat, his voice rough. We can fix this. We can still make them believe we're innocent. The bride looked up, her eyes hollow and empty. I don't know if I can keep pretending anymore, she whispered. I don't know if I can live with this. The groom's face twisted with emotion. What else are we supposed to do? This is our life, our future. You can't just walk away from it all. Not now. Not after everything we've built. The bride shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Everything we've built was a lie, she said, her voice trembling. And now, everyone knows. I can't keep hiding from that. The groom's anger flared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same brash arrogance that had defined him. This time, it was desperation, a man realizing that everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. Do you think this is easy for me? He shouted, his fists clenching. Do you think I'm not scared? Do you think I'm not ashamed of everything I've done? The bride didn't answer. She simply stood there, her body shaking with the weight of the truth. She had once been blinded by the allure of wealth, the promise of a perfect life, but now, all that was left was the wreckage of her choices. The truth was undeniable, and she knew it. The lies that had once kept her safe, that had kept her world intact, were now exposed for everyone to see. Meanwhile, outside the reception hall, Emma stood in the quiet of the garden, her breath visible in the cold air. She had done what she came to do, she had exposed the lies, the corruption, the deceit. But even though she had won the battle, the victory felt hollow. She had revealed the truth, but now what? What was left for her to do? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. She opened it, reading the words carefully. You've done the right thing. But the consequences of your actions are just beginning. Don't think this is over. A chill ran down Emma's spine. She had known that exposing the truth would have consequences, but she hadn't expected this sense of being watched, of being pursued. Was there more to this than just the couple she had exposed? Had her actions attracted the attention of people more powerful than she had anticipated? She shook off the feeling, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. She had come here to expose the truth, and she had done that. Everything else could wait. Back inside the reception hall, the guests were starting to filter out, one by one. The spectacle had lost its luster. The glamorous wedding that was supposed to be the event of the season had turned into a disaster, and no one was willing to stay to witness the final collapse. Emma made her way back into the hall, where the bride and groom were still standing, locked in a confrontation that neither could win. The groom's face was red with anger, his words growing more desperate. The bride, though still broken, had a quiet dignity about her now. She had accepted the truth, even if it had shattered her. When the couple noticed Emma's return, there was no longer any pretense. The groom's eyes narrowed, and the bride's expression was unreadable. Neither of them spoke. They had nothing left to say. Emma looked at them, her gaze steady. You wanted to live in a world of lies, she said softly. But the truth always has a way of coming to the surface. And now, you have to face it. The groom stepped forward, his face filled with a mixture of rage and regret. You've ruined everything, he said, his voice harsh. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built. It's all gone because of you. Emma stood her ground. You didn't build anything. You stole it. You lied, you manipulated, and you took advantage of everyone around you. This is what happens when you live a life built on deceit. The bride, her voice shaky, spoke up. I was part of this too. I ignored the signs, I turned a blind eye because I wanted the life you promised me. But now I don't know who I am anymore. Emma softened. You don't have to keep pretending. You can walk away from all of this. You can rebuild. It won't be easy, but it will be the right thing to do. The groom looked at the bride, his expression unreadable. For the first time that evening, he seemed lost. Broken in a way that money and power could not fix. The woman he had once seen as a partner in his web of lies was now a reflection of the truth that had finally shattered his world. Emma's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification that made her stomach turn. It was a news alert. The headline read, "Scandalous wedding exposes billionaire's corruption, the real story behind the lies." Emma felt a pang of guilt, but also a strange sense of satisfaction. The truth was out. The world would know what had really been happening behind closed doors. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she had done the right thing. "You'll never be able to undo what you've done," the groom said bitterly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But don't think you're going to get away with this." Emma met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "You'll have to face the consequences, just like everyone else. And that's something you'll have to live with." With that, Emma turned and walked away. She had exposed the truth. She had torn down the walls of lies, and now it was time to let everything fall where it would. The couple's world had been shattered, and it was no longer her responsibility to fix it. As she stepped out into the cold night, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she had done. The truth was always the hardest thing to confront, but once it was out, there was no going back. The couple's empire was in ruins, and now, they would have to live with the consequences of their actions. But as Emma walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had only just begun to reverberate through the lives of everyone involved. There would be no escaping the consequences. No one ever truly escaped the reckoning. And as the world would soon learn, the truth always had a way of finding its way to the surface.